RESTful services are becoming more and more popular. Many companies expose their APIs as RESTful services. Up until version 8.1, if developers wanted to consume a RESTful service in a where-I-am, they had to write a Java plugin. Starting from version 8.1, developers can consume RESTful services using a special where-I-am feature without having to write a Java plugin. In this video tutorial, I will explain how to use this feature. So what is a RESTful service? A call to a RESTful service is made via the HTTP protocol to a particular URL using GET or POST HTTP request. The name of the service is embedded in the URL itself. For example, parameters of the service are specified either in the URL or in the body of the HTTP request if POST requests are used. For example, here a parameter of the service is the number 12345, which is the ID of the user whose profile is being retrieved. Another example is this. Here parameters are specified as URL query parameters q equals Boston and API ID equals 12345. After the HTTP request has been made, the provider returns a reply, usually a string in the XML or JSON format. Some providers also require that before you make any HTTP calls, you authenticate yourself using an industry standard OAuth protocol. This involves a series of steps, at the end of which the caller is granted an access token that must be provided with each request to the service. A where-I-am handles all the details of the OAuth protocol behind the scenes, and we will cover these details later in this tutorial. Let's now look at how a developer can consume a RESTful service in a where-I-am. The general framework is this. A developer needs to define a business object representing a service provider, then define a communication channel in this object of the REST type. When defining the REST channel, specify OAuth settings if applicable, specify services of the provider, and for each service, define an object and attribute holding parameters of the service and an object holding the reply of the service. Write a process that issues the request service action to the service provider. Before calling the service, populate the specified attribute of the specified object with parameters of the service. After a call to the request service action has been made, an object representing the reply is automatically placed in the context and can then be used by subsequent rules. So if you are a developer, you need to carefully study the documentation of RESTful services provided by the service provider. You need to find out if the provider requires OAuth authentication, and for each service you need to consume, you need to find out the URL of the service, parameters of the service, and how the reply is handled. Then you need to enter this information into a where-I-am. Let's look at an example. First, let's take a look at an example that does not require OAuth authentication. Let's look at a website of a service provider that returns weather information for a specified city. If we go to the documentation of their API, we will see several services. You can specify city by name, ID, and so on. We will be looking at the service that returns weather information given the name of the city and the country code. So if we look at an example of the call to this service here, we can see that the URL of this service is this, and the parameters of the service are q equals city name and country code. There is, however, another parameter. If we go back to the general page, we can see that all services of this provider also require an API key. We need to register with this provider first, and then we will be given this key. So one extra parameter to the service is app ID equals API key. Here it is. Going back to this service, if we scroll further down, we can see how the reply is returned. We'll come back to this reply a little later. Here I have a BSV that implements a call to this service. So let's go through the configuration of this example. First and foremost, I have an object here that represents the service provider. We can see that the REST channel has been defined for this provider. Let's look at the settings. Here, one service called weather has been defined. Note that the URL of the service matches the one in the documentation. The parameter of the service is taken from the param attribute of the weather param object. This is the special object that we have created, and it represents parameters of the service. When we call the service, we will populate the values of the param attribute with the parameters of the service as required by the provider. Let's now look at the reply. We can see that the reply is returned in the object called weatherResponse. This is a special object that we have defined to hold the reply of the service. Let's have a look at it. This object matches JSON returned by the service. If we look at this JSON again, we can see that the entire reply is one object indicated by these curly brackets here. The object has several attributes: coord, sys, weather, main, and so on. If you want to handle these attributes in the reply, you must define them using exactly the same names as in the JSON. If you are not interested in certain attributes, you do not need to define them. In our object, we are only interested in attributes coord, main, weather, and DT, so we have defined them in the object. If we go back to JSON, we can see that some of these attributes represent their own objects with their own attributes. For example, coord here is an object with attributes long and lat. So we need to define such object as well. In this case, the object is called weatherResponse_coord, and it has lat and long attributes. Note again that the names of the objects do not matter, but the names of the attributes must match. So the type of the coord attribute in the response is weatherResponse_coord. Similarly, we can see that main and weather attributes are represented with their own objects. So we have defined these objects in the system and provided references to them in the response. DT, on the other hand, is a primitive attribute so we have defined it as plain text. A couple of notes here. If an array of responses is returned, a var_im puts multiple instances of the response object into the context. If an array of attributes is specified, you need to mark the corresponding reference as multiple allowed. And if an array of primitive attributes is returned, a var_im combines all values in one delimited string that can be placed in one attribute. Also, if you cannot specify the name of the attribute exactly as in JSON, for example, the name of the attribute is reserved in a var_im, You can specify any allowed name in a where_I_am, and then you need to specify a name mapping between JSON attribute names and the corresponding where_I_am attribute names. This is done in this table here. Let's now look at the process that calls the service. The input of the process is the city object. This object has the name of the city and the code of the country. The instance of this object is specified before a service is called. The process creates an instance of the service provider if it hasn't been created yet, and then creates a parameter object with the parameters required by the service that contains the name of the city, the code of the country, and the API ID, which is taken from the system settings object. Then the call to the service is made. After the call, the weather response object is in the context, and we can copy some of its values into the city object. Let's now see this in action. I will put the version under test and log in the browser. Here I have already entered the API key into the system settings object. So we will add a city and click on the Get Weather button that runs our process. And as we can see, the result is returned and some weather details are written into the city object. And here we can see the results. Let's now look at an example of a service provider that requires OAuth authentication. For example, Google. We will be retrieving a list of Google calendars for the current user. If we look at a Google documentation for Calendar API, we can see that it mentions OAuth 2.0. So we must define OAuth settings in a where_I_am. Let's see how we can do this. So here I have a BSV where everything is set up for consuming a Google service. As expected, there is an object that represents Google itself. The object has the REST channel defined. If the service provider requires OAuth authentication, this checkbox must be ticked and the settings defined. Here we can see that a where_I_am provides a predefined list of providers. And if you select a particular provider, a where_I_am will automatically populate the required settings with the predefined values. Which means that if your provider is in the list of the predefined providers, all you have to do is select the provider from the list, and then most values will be pre-populated for you. You still need to define some other values, such as API ID and secret. If you want to call services of the provider that requires OAuth authentication, you must register as a developer for this provider, and then you will be given API ID and secret. You need to specify these values here, either by providing them explicitly or by referring to the attributes of an object that stores them, for example, system settings. You also need to specify where the access token will be stored. Normally, you would store this token in an attribute of a system settings or logged in regular user object. You just need to define a placeholder attribute and refer to this attribute here. You don't need to worry about the value. A where_I_am will handle it behind the scenes. The rest is similar to calling the service that does not require OAuth authentication. In this example, we will be calling a service that retrieves a list of existing calendars for the current user. This is the URL of the service. The service doesn't take any parameters, and the reply is returned as a JSON object. Let's have a look at this object. The object includes an array of calendar item objects, so multiple allowed is ticked. And this is the process that calls the service. There are no parameters to worry about. The request to the service is made, and then the resulting calendar list is displayed. Let's run this example. So we put the version under test and log into the browser. Here I have already entered API ID and secret into the system settings object. So we select the Get Calendars item that runs our process. Here we can see that the OAuth authentication process kicks in, and Google automatically redirects to a page where the current user has to allow the application to access his calendars. We choose an account, and we can see that the list of the calendars is displayed. What should a developer do if a service provider that requires OAuth authentication is not in the list of the predefined providers? In this case, he needs to specify OAuth settings himself. To do this, he needs to study the OAuth documentation of the provider very carefully. And the first question to answer is which version of OAuth protocol the provider supports, version 1 or 2. OAuth settings for both versions are quite different. Then it is best to select a provider from the list who supports the same version in order to pre-populate the dialog with the default values. You may find that most of these values will be the same for this new provider. You only need to override these default values if the documentation says that they are different. It is also possible to then add the new provider to the list of the predefined providers, so that you do not have to enter these values again. Since this video tutorial has been made, AwareIM has released a new version, 8.3, that contains some improvements to the REST functionality. In this section, I will quickly go through the list of improvements. Everything that the tutorial has been talking about so far remains valid, but there are some improvements that make consuming REST services easier for the developer. First of all, in the previous version, if parameters of the service represented a JSON or XML string, the developer had to create this string and set it into the attribute of some object. Now the developer can define a business object that corresponds to the attributes of the JSON string and specify this object as a parameter of the service. So if we have an object with the REST services exposed, I can specify that the object should be taken from a context, and I will not specify any specific attributes of this object. So when this object is placed into the context, at runtime, AwareIM will automatically convert it into the corresponding JSON or XML string. In the previous version, it was not possible to consume a service that required a binary parameter. In the new version, it is possible. you just need to select application octet stream as the parameter type, and then specify a document or picture attribute of some object in context that holds the binary value. Moreover, if the service requires several parameters, some of them binary and some of them not, you can specify them separately as multiple parts, one part for each parameter. So we can add a part here, and this can be a binary part or a non-binary part. For example, this attribute. There are some other improvements as well, but probably the best improvement in version 8.3 is the ability to discover RESTful services, provided that there exists a file in an open API format that describes the services of the provider. Such files have been created for many well-known providers. If we go to this URL, we will find lots of open API files for many service providers. Let's discover services described in one such file. So I will specify the URL of this file, and then where I am will automatically discover all services exposed at by this provider. I can select all or some of the services that I will be using in the application. Let's select all. When we save the object, we can see that the definition of all objects that the services use as parameters or replies have been automatically created and added to the system. These are just a few examples of these objects, so that we do not have to define all the attributes of the objects ourselves. Let's try another file, services from Amazon. So here we have some files from Amazon, and we will use this one here. I'll copy its URL. And paste it here. Let's select all services. We can see there's quite a few. And then when we click OK, we get this warning. This is because some parameters and replies are primitive values that can only be mapped to an attribute of some object. ORM does not know which object you want to store such value in, so it just puts object attribute in there. And you need to manually specify the specific object and attribute that you want to store the value in. For now, we will ignore the warning. And when we save the object, we can see dozens of objects added to the system automatically.